There we go. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I hope we're all doing well this morning. We're kind of continuing in our we did everything you need to know about church history in 40 minutes or less 2 weeks ago, right? Just an absolute speed run through 2,000 years. Great. And then last week was sort of the story of St. Martin's, right? Our story. And so this week, we're going to talk about Episcopal Church history, how we got here. How did we end up with the Episcopal Church, even the name, but part of the Anglican Church? What's the deal? All of that. So before we get started, would y'all pray with me? Almighty God, thank you for today. Thank you that you're faithful and that you've always been with us. Lord, thank you that we are here. Thank you that we are who we are. God, give us an openness to hear and understand and listen and learn and see where your faithfulness has been true in the last 500 years. It is in and through your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so how we got here. We're going through 5 sort of eras of Episcopal Anglican history. First one is going to be the English Reformation. That's where we're starting, right? We're not going to go all the way back to the resurrection. We're going to start right around 1521, the year of our Lord. We're going to talk about the English Reformation. We're going to talk about American expansion, how we ended up over here, Civil War, post-Civil War, and the modern church. So that's kind of going to be our breakdown from there. So starting with the English Reformation, was it really all about divorce, right? How many of y'all have an understanding that our church really stems from the fact that Henry VIII was like, Catherine Aragon is not for me, and so we're going to start a brand new church, and that's how we ended up where we are, right? Yes? All right. Yes, and I am oversimplifying it, Leanne, I promise. Now, was it really all about divorce? Short answer, no. Long answer, no, but Henry VIII was granted the title of Defender of the Faith by the Pope in 1521, but he was denied an annulment to his marriage, right? He wanted a son. She was unable to provide a son. He wanted an annulment for the marriage, and the Pope said, no, I'm not going to do all that. And so with the rising tide of the Reformation kind of sweeping through all of Europe at that point, Henry saw an opportunity, right, to get what he wanted and to consolidate his power and kind of take all of the church's authority and its holdings. At the same time, a number of English reformers saw this as their opportunity to break from the corruption and the hoarding of wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. So even while Henry was still in effect Catholic, there was really no change in theology at this point, right? He was still in effect quite Catholic. This was a mutually beneficial relationship for Henry and the reformers, right? Does that make sense? So he got what he wanted, reformers got what they wanted, and so the Church of England became. After Henry died, his son Edward VI took the throne and the title Defender of the Faith. So the Defender of the Faith is still a title that's used for monarchs in England to this day. That was granted to Henry in 1521 by the Pope as sort of the Defender of the Faith in the lands of England, right? Because it was the Catholic Church. So Edward VI took the title and the throne, and he relied heavily on a guy named Thomas Cranmer. He wrote the first book, BCP, right? And so we still have lots of his writings and prayers that have been kind of modernized into our language in our BCP today. He was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and Edward kind of relied on him for theological and governmental guidance. So we're going to see that for a very, very long time in the Church of England, the crown and the church were synonymous. They were basically the same thing, right? And so Thomas Cranmer had a lot of governmental influence and theological influence. Thus, the liturgy and theology of the Church of England became markedly more Protestant and Reformed because Thomas Cranmer was a reformer, right? So up until Henry's death, basically the same. It was called the Sarum Rite. It was just the English rite. It was the Catholic rite, but just in English. That's all it was. And then when he died, the liturgy became markedly more Protestant and Reformed, way more than when it was under King Henry. Clear as day in the liturgies and prayers in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, and the 1552. So if you care at all to look back at those documents, they're wonderful and interesting, and I love them. But they are, you can see that like the deep shift from real kind of Catholic theology into a more Protestant and Reformed thing. So then we move on to the end of the Reformation, and bloody wars in England fought over this specific and exact thing. So after his reign, his half-sister Mary Tudor, which I think is today the day she died, Alan? Is that right? Yeah, so today she is her death day. Okay. She took the throne for a few years. Not a very long time at all. She had a very short reign, but very bloody reign, because she reinstated the Catholic Church as the state religion. And she was known for her brutal, and kind of vicious war that was waged on openly and discovered Protestants, killing almost 300 people, men, women, and children, on the grounds of heresy. So some were burned, some were hanged, some were tried and thrown in prison, and then burned or hanged, right? And these were all people who were Protestants. So this is Bloody Mary. This is where her nickname comes from, because she waged a truly vicious war on admitted and discovered Protestants in England. So after that, once her reign came to an end, her half-sister Elizabeth I took the throne. She reinstated a more subdued sort of Protestantism that was really aimed at sort of a compromise between like, okay. We have seen what making this the thing and the only thing, and anything else is illegal and worthy of death, does to a nation, and we don't want to do that. So she, with the Elizabethan settlement, settled this, right? This kind of bloody war sort of started to come to an end. It was an effort to compromise with English Catholics. Part of the Elizabethan settlement as well was the act of approval by Parliament of the 39 Articles. If you look in the back of the BCP, you'll find the 39 Articles. It's 39 very Protestant and Reformed doctrinal positions that were held by 1571. And so this is sort of like, you'll find this in the back. I quite like the 39 Articles, but it's kind of my job too. So this is great. Then, moving on, American expansion, KJV, and the Puritan revolutions. After Queen Elizabeth's decades-long reign, she had an incredibly long reign. If your name is Elizabeth in England and you're a queen, you're going to rule for a very long time. So her cousin, James I, King of Scotland, right, he was already the king in Scotland, succeeded her as monarch in England. He immediately authorized a new English translation of the Bible, the KJV, the King James Version, right? In 1607, the first permanent Anglican settlement was established in Jamestown, Virginia, James. And this was quickly followed by the rest, just a bunch of other settlements kind of in the South and the Mid-Atlantic region on the eastern seaboard. So at this point, the crown and the church were basically synonymous. Right? If you're talking about the crown, you're talking about the church. If you're talking about the church, you're talking about the crown. Because the monarch is still, what was the title? Does anyone remember? Defender of the faith, exactly. So they were still the governor of the church. And even to this day, like Archbishop Justin Welby, he just stepped down last week, right? He resigned. And so how is the next one going to be kind of put in place? The king is going to appoint the next archbishop. That's not an elected position. That is an appointed position by the king or queen, the monarch. So they also decided at this point to set up a vestry system. So any of our vestry members, this is where that comes from, because they wanted to make sure that clergy, especially across the Atlantic, did not become kind of sole leaders within their congregation. So one of the things that was also happening at this point, because these settlements were so Anglican in nature, right? What your community, what your social life was incredibly church life as well. So vestries had so much power. They took taxes. Vestries could do a lot even within the community and the church because, again, the crown and the church were the same thing. Does that make sense? So vestries have less power, but not by a lot these days. That was a bit. Amid the rising tensions between Puritans and Anglicans, so this is one of those things. Puritans in the U.S., that was split almost exactly down geographic lines, right? So Puritans were up north, Anglicans were in the south, right? And so Puritans were, and then Catholics were in Maryland, right? And that's where they lived. Baptists were in Rhode Island. But everybody else was Puritan or Anglican, right? And then, so there was a lot of tension split almost evenly down geographical lines. Where you lived is how you worshiped. Where you lived is what you believed, right? And Puritans were Congregationalists. They had no interest in the hierarchy. They had no interest in this is like how this is top down, that your parish priest truly parish like a geographical area, right? So if you live there, that's where you go to church, right? They had no interest in that. And so we see the Puritans, that they came over from England as well, because they were sick of whatever was going on over in England, right? That's the sort of like religious freedom they came over to practice. It hit a tipping point in England, and they revolted and killed King Charles I, right, in 1649, and installed their own Lord Protector. So there was no longer a king in England. There was a Lord Protector, right? And that was Oliver Cromwell. And then a couple years later, Richard Cromwell, Oliver's son, took the title as well and was eventually overthrown and killed, replaced by King Charles II in 1660. So we had about 11 years of just rampant Congregationalism, but we're back, okay? Things are good again. And then under his leadership, we got the 1662 prayer book in England. Right. And so Thanksgiving Eve, Alan's going to talk about this in his announcements before next service, but we're going to do our liturgy for Thanksgiving Eve out of the 1662 prayer book, which is still approved and published and in use in England today. And it would have been what our kind of forebears were using at this point in the colonies. Yes, Sam?
How many publications, like how many versions of the prayer book are there?
That's the fourth one.
How many?
Today? Ooh, brother. I think, let's see, there was 1780. That was an American prayer book. Then we had a 1928, 1979. So we're on our seventh one in America. England, I think, has had one revision since then. It's called the Book of Common Worship. And it's just an updated language thing. But every Anglican church has their own, right? So like one of the big popular ones for the Anglican Communion is the New Zealand prayer book, right? That's a beautiful prayer book. There's prayer books in Spanish. There's prayer books in all different languages, and they're all slightly different, kind of taking from the culture, being within the culture that they are kind of serving at that point, which is why we'll talk about in a few minutes why America decided it needed its own prayer book, and we weren't just going to keep using the same thing that England was giving us over and over and over and over and over again, especially because, I don't know if it's the next slide. Is it? Maybe. When, up to the point of the American Revolution, so we're kind of on the cusp of this at this point. So 1660, we're kind of fast forwarding a couple years to right where the American Revolution, we're on the cusp of it. The Church of England, the Crown, remember that, still held enormous sway and power within the colonies. This meant when it came time for the revolution, it was going to happen whether we liked it or not. There was no stopping it. Most Anglican churches in the New World were overseen by the Bishop of England. So this is where all of the, if you wanted to we're overseen by Andy Doyle and a number of other bishops, right? But they live maybe 250 miles away. They're across an ocean from their bishop. And so there's no real oversight. It's just pro forma, except that the vestries in these Anglican communities were quite loyal to the monarch and the king. And at this point, most of the American clergy were, at the very least in public, still loyal to the king, right? Because they had to take a vow of loyalty in their ordination vows. That's one of the big reasons we needed our own prayer book, is because after the revolution, we'll get to it, we were like, why on earth are we going to take a vow of loyalty to a king who is not our king, right? So I think it's still part of the ordination vows in England, is a vow of loyalty to the governor of the church, the defender of the faith, the monarch, right? So then we get to Samuel Seabury, who was our first bishop in America. After the Revolution, American churches and clergy wanted their own bishop, right? At this point, there are no bishops in America. And we're a church of bishops. That's what Episcopal means, right? It's just weird. That means church of bishops. Episcopate, episcopacy, that just means the word bishop. And so in 1784, we elected Samuel Seabury to serve in the episcopate. But because bishops need to be consecrated through the apostolic lineage, meaning bishops make bishops, right? You can't just decide to be a bishop. There has to be a laying on of hands. There needs to be other bishops present to make a bishop. He had to go where the bishops were, and where were they? England, exactly. And so he went over to England, and they were like, yeah, man, we'll absolutely consecrate you. Now take your oath of loyalty to the king. And he was like, I'm not doing that. We just fought a war about that. That's not happening, right? And so he went north to Scotland, where non-juring bishops, meaning that they didn't have really a say in the kind of politics of the church, but they were bishops nonetheless. They were in the Scottish Episcopal Church. And they were like, dude, yeah, we don't like him either. We will absolutely consecrate you as a bishop. And so they did, which is why our church, the Episcopal Church in America, is called the Episcopal Church, because our lineage goes back to the Scottish Episcopal Church. We're not Anglican. We are Anglican in polity and in practice, but our title, our word, our identity is as Episcopalians because we come from the Scottish Episcopal Church. And they were more than happy to consecrate somebody who was unwilling to kowtow to the king. All right, we're at this point. Any questions? Yes.
How did the bishops of Scotland become bishops?
They were made bishops by the English bishops. So they were made bishops by the English bishops. There was a civil war in England, so there was a sort of spreading out of everything, and so they were already bishops. But hey, they rewrote their prayer book, right? They had their own thing. One of the stipulations for Samuel Seabury to become a bishop was, hey, use the Scottish Rite for a little bit until y'all write your own thing. And he was like, yeah, okay. Which, fascinatingly enough, this is fun, just a fun little thing. Our Eucharistic prayer D is directly taken from the Scottish Rite and updated in language. So prayer D, which actually looks a lot like the Eastern Orthodox Church, because then there's a lot of reasons why that is, including that like the Eastern Orthodox had a hold in Scotland, and then Scotland wrote their own thing, and then we took it from Scotland, and now it's ours in prayer D, right? Thanks, April. You look like you're having fun. So they became bishops because they were ordained before. Yeah. So any other questions about how we?
So
Yes.
there used to be a required tithe. Is that correct? It seems
Oh yeah, the
like-
vestries.
And then
Yeah.
so in the American church, the Baptists, I think, were the ones that fought for separation of church and state, so
Mhm.
they didn't have to pay
Yeah.
this tithe to the English church.
Yes. So this was pre-revolution, right? And so Baptists were all about separation of church and state. Yeah, and they were, well, fun, right? But after the revolution, we became our church, which was founded in no small way as a kind of a, I'm trying to think of an appropriate word here. Our church was founded in resistance to empire in a very real way, right? We said no to a king. We said no to an empire. Our entire history as a church, as the Episcopal Church in the United States, was founded against like becoming united with an empire. So at this point, the government and the church are separated, right? Even in the Episcopal Church, especially in the Episcopal Church. We did have most presidents up to a certain point were in fact Episcopalians, but the church itself had no governmental authority. Whereas in England, bishops and archbishops are still members of parliament today, right? Some of them can vote, some of them can't, but they're all members of parliament. So there's more of a separation, but here in America, there is a distinct separation between church and state. Yes, Sam?
If they're members of parliament, can they be voted out?
Appointed. So no. Crazy, right? Anyway, We are at the Civil War. Anything else? Excellent. We're at the Civil War. So upon the return of Samuel Seabury to the United States, 1785, Anglicans in the U.S. have their first general convention. This is where we start this kind of 3-year, let's get all our bishops together. Let's get some of our deputies together. Let's make some decisions that's going to be for our church. We're not going to let someone else decide for us anymore. We're going to make decisions for ourselves. This is where they approve the creation of the American Prayer Book, right? And so in 1786, they do it, right? People, it's much the same, right? It's much the same, but it is the first truly American prayer book. And so you can find that. It's not a very popular one because it is almost no different than the 1662, but it's American. This is also where we take the name, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. That is technically our name. How fun is that, right? We are the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Where Alan and I went to school is Virginia Theological Seminary, right? That's where we both went to school. But the technical name of it, still on paper, is the Protestant Episcopal Seminary Protestant Episcopal Theological Seminary in Virginia, which is nuts. And so it's fun. So we see the creation of the American Prayer Book, used on a state-by-state basis. Some people still like the 1662. There's still some holdovers. More bishops are elected and consecrated, and at the end of the century, right before 1800, the first presiding bishop, William White, is consecrated in 1789, and this is interesting, by virtue of his seniority. He's the oldest bishop, so he became the presiding bishop. We don't do that anymore, because that would be crazy. But he was the oldest bishop, he became the presiding bishop, and that's how we did it for a very long time. In 1806, the Episcopal Church, I'm not going to write out the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, that's what that means, ordains the first black priest in Absalom Jones. We did that in 1806. He was working in Philadelphia. He would later found the African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? Because even at this point, even though we were, ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, there were tons of white people in the North who did not want a black priest in their church, right? And so he went to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so the first founding of that was also in Philadelphia, and it was a huge success and went on to plant lots and lots of churches, and that was Absalom Jones. The first half of the century, it also sees this missional expansion to the west and further south, and the establishment of Episcopal schools and seminaries. So my school, Virginia, was founded in 1823, right? So we just had our bicentenary, as our British dean likes to call it, which was our 200th anniversary, which was crazy. And then so during the Civil War, so the Civil War erupts. Lots of reasons for that. We can talk about that at any other point. But the southern states decide to join, they come together and they join the Protestant Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America. They have their own church, right? So they secede, they become the Confederate States of America, and so the Episcopal Church in those states go with them. And they elect their own presiding bishop, Leonidas Polk. This is a guy who, he actually has a weird history with the Diocese of Texas. He was the one who sent our first missionary bishop out here to kind of found this diocese. So this was a little bit of a checkered past, right? He also founded the University of the South at Sewanee and its adjoining seminary, right? And so it's when you go to Sewanee, it's weird because there's a statue of the man, but he was a Confederate bishop. So anyway, after the failure of the Confederate States, the Southern Episcopal churches were welcomed back into the Episcopal Church under some stipulations, like don't do that again. And they were welcomed back. And then Reconstruction saw the formation of the Worldwide Anglican Communion. Now, this is a confusing thing, and it's my favorite thing about our church. It's the best. One of my favorite things ever. We are part of the Anglican Communion. Does anyone know what that means? Excellent. I can't wait to tell you. We are part of a group of people who decide to be together, right? So we're the Episcopal Church. We come from the Anglican Church, right? And so at this point, there was lots of colonial expansion from England and from America, right? We went out, we planted churches, we had other Anglican churches all over the world. And so we decided at that point, the Anglican Church in England decided, okay, you guys are not ours anymore. We get that. We're not going to fight you on that anymore. But because we all practice the same faith and because we all worship in the same way, we're all still Anglican. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come together, we're going to decide to be together, and we're going to worship as a communion of worldwide Anglicans. So this was established in 1867 and the Lambeth Conference. Lambeth is this whole thing where a bunch of bishops and archbishops go to England and they decide stuff, and it's mostly just a meeting every 9 years, right? But the Anglican Communion is one of my favorite things because it says that there is no real locus of power anywhere, that we are all equal. So even at this point in our church's history today, yes, Sam?
I was gonna ask why the Lambeth Conference is every 9 years.
Yeah, we just pick numbers, I think. I really don't know. I'm sure there's like a good theological reason. I honestly have no idea. I think maybe the first archbishop like died after 9 years, and they were like, that's the time, maybe. If anyone knows, let me know. But even today with the Anglican Communion, there are 85 million Anglicans worldwide, right? And so there are roughly 4 million Episcopal people who claim to be Episcopal in America. We are a very, very small percentage of a worldwide Anglican communion. So there is this decision to stay together even when we disagree. I love the Anglican communion so deeply because even though we're a part of a church that is maybe more progressive in some ways, we are still aligning ourselves. We are still going to the table with. We are still having communion with. We are still in communion with people with whom we disagree. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing because we say that what's more important than any of the things that divide us is what unites us. So I love the Anglican Communion. And this was founded in 1867. I could do a whole thing about it. We'll talk about it later. Now, Lambeth Conference, yes, we talked about that. In America, a new BCP was approved and published in 1928. So we are into the 20th century, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going on and happening. I'm going to finish soon. With a new translation of the Psalms and some minor revisions to liturgies in the Eucharistic prayer. So if you look in the BCP, you will find that we typically do Eucharistic prayers A, B, C, or D, right? And then when we do Rite 1, we pull that from the 1928 prayer book. So Eucharistic prayer 1 and 2 and the liturgy for baptism and everything. That's from the 1928 prayer book. So then 1961 saw the election. Okay, so it was in 1927 at our general convention that we stopped electing or just letting the oldest person in the House of Bishops be the presiding bishop. We said, okay, let's have somebody who might be better at this job do the job, not just the oldest guy there is, right? And so then we get to 1961, the election of Bishop John Hines from Texas, baby. It was great. We got our own guy. And so he was the bishop of Texas. He was the first guy who actually gave up his seat as a diocesan bishop. So up until 1961, all of our presiding bishops would continue to be the bishops of their diocese. So they were also presiding bishop over, the continental United States. But John Hines decided, it's too big a job. Somebody else can do Texas because Texas is too dang big as is. And so somebody else can do that job. I'll do the presiding bishop job. He was the first presiding bishop who was incredibly open and active and willing to change, especially with the strong commitments to social justice. This angered a lot of the more conservative members of the church. He was the one who was kind of this forerunner as a big proponent of women's ordination in the church in 1961, right? And so women's participation under his leadership, so 1961, 1970, right? His last year as presiding bishop, women's participation in the church took a turn in 1970. So this is when women could first be allowed to take part in the councils of the church as members of the House of Deputies. So because we are, a definitively American thing, our sort of governance looks a lot like the American government. We have two houses of legislature. We have the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops, right? And so the House of Deputies are lay people, they're priests, they're people from all over. And then the House of Deputies, think of them as senators, right? We have congressmen, we have senators, right? And so we end up with women are allowed to take part in the governance of the church at the House of Deputies in 1970. And then in 1974, the first women were ordained to the priesthood in Philadelphia in what was called an irregular ordination. So this was not approved. This was not decided by the church that this was a good thing to do. This was the right thing to do, but it was not approved until 1976, 2 years later. So then we get to General Convention and we say, okay, we did it. Are we okay with it, or are we going to make their orders null and void? What are we going to do? And so it's like, okay, let's go ahead and make all women able to be ordained if they are so called and approved. So 1976, we approve women's ordination in the church, and then we also approved the generation of a new BCP, 1979. It was a very, very busy General Convention that year because they're mostly incredibly boring. Then we get to the modern church. Anything basically from Civil War to 1980 from y'all? Any questions? Excellent. Modern church. Barbara Harris is the first woman in the Anglican Communion worldwide to be elected to the episcopacy. She's the first woman. She's in Massachusetts. She had she was such a funny lady. She died very recently. She was such a silly lady. When she was getting consecrated, she got death threats on death threats on death threats, right? And they were like, Bishop Barbara, you got to wear a bulletproof vest. And she was like, no. If they're going to do it, they can kill me in front of God and everybody. She was a spitfire. She was so cool. She also had a little pocket sewn into all of her stoles in the back to put her cigarettes. And so when she was like greeting people outside like Alan and I do, she'd be like, hi, honey. Hi. She was the best. She's so cool. So Barbara Harris, she becomes the first bishop elected and consecrated in the worldwide Anglican Communion in 1989. The turn of the century sees the Episcopal Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America sign on to Called to Common Mission. This was a document that we kind of put together with them, and we established full communion between both churches in 2000. So what this means is that if it necessitates it, I can go serve at an ELCA church. And I don't have to let anybody know. I should let my bishop know, but I don't have to get like approval or anything like that. And they can come serve here, and we can use each other's liturgies without breaking our vows to our church, right? So 2003, General Convention approves the election and consecration of Gene Robinson, who was the first openly gay and partnered bishop in the Anglican Communion, and this causes fractures across the church. So the Anglican Communion was like, what are y'all doing? And then some people in the Episcopal Church were like, what are y'all doing? And so what happens there is these fractures eventually cause the split that we talk about sometimes. It started, actually, funnily enough, in Fort Worth.